it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Michaela Sambanis to the University College Cork. She is today's keynote speaker and will speak on drama activities in the foreign language classroom and in teacher training. And just to remind you a little bit about her professional background. Michaela Sambanis is Chair of English Didactics at the Institute of English Language and Literature at the Freie Universität Berlin, Germany. From 2008 to 2011, she chaired a large interdisciplinary research unit at the Transfer Center for Neuroscience and Learning at the University of Ulm. Her research interests include pedagogy, translation, and application of findings from neuroscience, empirical research, literature, drama in language teaching and learning, as well as drama methods in teacher training. She published a book recently with the title Fremdsprachenunterricht und Neurowissenschaften, and I think, that's my personal view, it's sort of a milestone for the discussions we have in the field of performative teaching and learning. So, very delighted to have you here today.
Thank you very much. So, pleasure is all mine to be here today and to be able to talk to you and to take on or to look at our topic, here at hand, from a neuroscientific and a didactic perspective, raising the question whether evidence from brain research and didactics can support drama-based approaches in foreign language teaching and learning. So, since you introduced me so well, thanks again, I can almost skip this slide and get straight, because I thought I owed you an answer, an explication why I do this connection to neuroscience and didactics. Is it just a cheap marketing ploy, or is there something behind it? And actually, so it's a part of my work, and it has been a part of my work, and still I'm working with the Transfer Center for Neuroscience and Learning in Ulm, the ZNL, as I'm a member of their scientific board, and I still cooperate in studies and with the colleagues there. But then I can go straight on to move on to the overview over my talk. In the next 45 minutes, we will take a look at the potential of drama in educational context in light of findings from neuroscience. And the German neuroscientist Manfred Spitzer, who by the way is head and coordinator of the aforementioned ZNL, the Transfer Center in Ulm, argues in favor of theater methods applied to educational contexts. And this brings us back to what I said yesterday, right here in the panel discussion. Here's a quote in German, and it says in essence that from what we currently know about how the brain works, it sounds plausible, it sounds like a really good idea not to ban theater methods from classrooms. So, the question that I'd like to talk about today is the why. Why does it seem plausible to consider drama activities as efficient and brain-friendly tools, especially when it comes to language, social, aesthetic, and cultural learning? In this context, my talk will illustrate some aspects of brain mechanisms to show how the brain works and what factors influence, hinder, or enhance learning processes. In this context, we will take a look at the duality of body and mind in learning, and the influence of cognition and emotion on learning processes. This will lead us to drama as a tool in the FL classroom, and finally to drama as a tool in teacher education. Examining the potential of drama in educational contexts in light of findings from neuroscience means building bridges between neuroscience and didactics, as well as between research and practice. And I think we all agree that it is important to bridge the gap in a sustainable manner in order to minimize the danger of misinterpretations, misapplications, and also misuse of brain research in educational contexts. But how can this bridging from research to practice succeed? Well, this is how I do it. I, of course, read a lot of neuroscientific studies. I plan and participate in interdisciplinary studies, often with data collected in the lab, with a brain scanner, EEG, and so on. And how shall I put it? As a former practitioner, and you know I've been teaching for more than 10 years as a teacher at primary and secondary schools, I often have a hunch that these findings could be interesting to language teachers as well. But let me make this clear. Teaching does not happen in the lab. So I think there's an immense danger of misinterpretation in the case of direct conclusions. I think the translation of findings from neuroscience to classroom procedures and practices needs a link, and this is what we call translational research. What does it imply? Well, before giving advice to teachers, I do additional studies in the classroom, then carefully link my findings to those from neuroscience and take these together as the basis for suggestions, applications, and conclusions. Let me illustrate this. Here's an example. A couple of years ago, I came across studies from neuroscience that investigated the effects of movement-based learning in contrast to learning without movement, such as the NOBJECT study by my colleagues Kiefer et al. The researchers invented 64 non-existing objects, the NOBJECTs, to make sure, to make sure nobody knew them. This is elimination of prior knowledge. Then they projected these NOBJECTs and named them. The elimination of prior knowledge is important as study participants had to learn the objects' names. They had to learn to match object and name, object name and corresponding object. So in the study, Kiefer and et al. Worked with an experimental control design. The experimentals learned the objects' names together with the corresponding gesture, whereas the controls didn't use gestures. So the controls learning condition resembles a lot what we often do in the language classroom, introducing words with pictures and word cards, for example. Now let's take a look at the results. The experimental group scored better with regard to correctness, rapidity of retrieval, and flexibility of use. The EEG recordings showed a higher activation in frontal motor regions of the experimentals only, which means of those who learned with movements. So the next question would be, what's the significance of these findings? Well, it shows us that the use of gestures or movement during learning, we call it the encoding phase, influences the way in which the brain processes, links, and stores the information. As we will see in a bit, the use of movement in learning does not only lead to higher retention rates, but also to more durable, more stable retention. Or, in other words, it is far harder to forget something we have learned with body and mind. Learning with movement leads to learning with greater precision, speed, and retention. Of course, the data was gathered in the lab, so not in the real world of the classroom, or in classroom settings with a multitude of factors influencing and distracting children. So in my opinion, these are important findings. However, as mentioned before, a direct application to the classroom at this point without the appropriate link would have been premature and might have led to misinterpretations. So hence, it was time for empirical research in the classroom. And that's exactly what we did. We carried out several studies in the foreign language classrooms, and these the graph shows the results of our first study. The participants here were teenagers, 14 to 15-year-olds, which means learners at the age when hormones are holding brains hostage, and the age when parents are weird and teachers annoying, and learning Latin, target language in this study, seems to be pretty much a waste of time. So this was our first and very challenging target group. They have to learn 18 lexical items. The group where it says traditional, they didn't use gestures, and the group called scenic, szenisches Lernen, with gestures, mime, etc. I'd like to add that scenic learning describes a procedure where content, for example lexical items, is taught together with corresponding gestures, which means gestures that make sense. During presentation and training sessions, the teacher invites students to join the choral repetitions of the content together with a couple of movements. So not only does the engaging in physical activity provide students with a much needed break from long sedentary time, which affects their level of motivation, but what is more, it creates more links in the brain's networks. And in addition to language-related brain areas, it activates, amongst others, motor centers. So there is evidence that this novel approach of linking language and motor function in teaching and learning is fruitful. Back to the graph. In the beginning, as you can see, this is test round 1, Westzeitpunkt 1, it says in German. We had no significant difference between the two groups, traditional or scenic learning. And after the introduction and test round 1, no further training of the words took place in neither group. Then, if you take a look at test round 2, the controls had started to forget. They had started to erase from memory. The experimentals, however, remembered more words than in test round 1. So, surprising to us, because learning without training. Then the results remain stable on a high level over time, which means weeks and even months in the long run, so to speak. So the experimentals remembered 16 out of 18 words, the controls only 3. And that really makes a difference. Of course, we replicated the study with different age groups in French, Latin, English classes with always consistent results. And this raises the following questions. Why do learners show better results when learning with body movements? A first attempt to explain this phenomenon leads us to a brain structure called the hippocampus. Hippocampus is a part of the limbic system. This is where emotions are processed. The limbic system consists of several structures that constantly influence our thinking and decision making. There is no such thing as a completely rational decision making, as we cannot turn off the limbic system. Together with the amygdala, you can see it's the neighboring structure, number 6 in the graph. Together with the amygdala, also part of the limbic system, the hippocampus acts as the bottleneck structure of our brain. It's the amygdala's function to assess the harmfulness of situations and sensory inputs, whereas the hippocampus acts as our novelty detector. Our detector in our surrounding, for everything in our surrounding that seems unusual, extraordinary, remarking, touching, moving. So, if teachers present content coupled to movement, it has, in most classrooms, a novelty effect, or at least an effect of change to sedentary time. As a consequence, the hippocampus is activated. Note that the hippocampus plays an important role in learning. Many inputs are processed in the hippocampus, and during a phase called consolidation, the entries get sorted out, and if worth getting stored permanently, they have to be transferred to a larger brain section or brain structure, namely the neocortex, as the hippocampus here is fast but relatively small, approximately the size of a pinky finger. So due to replay mechanisms, our brain is able to transfer information from the hippocampus to the neocortex for long-term storage. So in summary, we can say it is desirable to, figuratively speaking, get the hippocampus's attention, for example, by the use of movements, pantomime, songs, and whatnot. This leads us to another interesting question. Do fluid movements and statues, frozen images, as in, for example, yoga positions, have comparable effects on learning? And here's the answer. Apparently, they do. Yep. In this study, we had 3 test runs in all. 2 are shown in the graph. It was a study on comprehension of a text and vocab acquisition. In test round 1, again, no difference between the 2 groups occurred. Test round 2 showed only a slightly different effect. Then there was an interim phase of 6.5 weeks between test round 2 and test round 3. During those 6.5 weeks, all kids dispersed for the summer holidays, were far away from the English classroom. The third test was unannounced, administered right after the holidays at the beginning of the next school year. And here are the results. You can see that the yoga kids, the light gray columns in the graph, outperformed the other group, and statistically speaking, in terms of significances. So they outperformed them significantly. In summary, it can be stated that again we found the same surprising effects as already mentioned before. An increase in knowledge and competencies without further exercises. And to come back to the question whether the effects are limited to fluid movements, we can state that apparently statues have a comparable effect. Talking about effects, let's summarize. We were able to show positive effects on retention when students learn content together with movements. Connecting several stimuli leads to more effective processing and enhances the encoding process. Or, as Eric Kandel put it, the better something is encoded in memory, the easier it is to recall. End of quote. Note that mere perceptual processing does not seem sufficient. The learners have to be active, but then a couple of repetitions of the utterance accompanied by the corresponding gesture suffice. Afterwards, our brain remembers the movements without us performing them anymore. Motor centers keep being activated. So you don't have to move all the time. We found strongest positive effects on long-term retention, and the effect size D for scenic learning is stunning, ranging around 2.6, which is really, really impressive, a very strong effect visible, especially over time. Yeah, that's good news. So learning with movements makes a difference. But now the question is, how can we explain the positive effects, especially on long-term retention? And what could possibly cause the improvement over time, the rising curve? There must be something going on in the brain that learners are not aware of. But what exactly is it? So here's the first bit of my explanation. What data shows us is at least partly due to multimodal encoding, or what we call in didactics multisensory learning. Note that learning consists of two complementary phases. One, the encoding phase, which means the confrontation with the new knowledge or skills, the so-called intake phase. Two, the aforementioned consolidation phase, the sorting out, the erasing or the processing of entries from limited brain structures to larger structures. We'll come back to the consolidation phase later. Multisensory learning influences the way that intake is processed in the brain, and it activates additional regions and leads to the creation of more links to one entry than monosensory learning. Secondly, there's evidence for the claim that the effects only show when students do the movements on their own, in contrast to merely watching the teacher move. So student activation is a key factor here. 3, there's reason to believe that the retention effects observed are due to unconscious repetitions, causing the reactivation of the corresponding networks. Let me explain this. We believe that when children play and do spare time activities that involve body movements that are alike to those used in the classroom, they lead to the repetition of content in their brain. They trigger something in the brain. So repetition takes place without students being conscious of the reviewing process. Consolidation is another factor. As already mentioned before, consolidation phases are essential for learning to occur. Input alone does not guarantee learning and progression. On the contrary. As you can see in the picture, there is a connection between consolidation and sleep. Sleep offers ideal conditions for consolidation, as the input from the surrounding is limited. Visual inputs are blocked out by us closing our eyes, for example. Still, while we're sleeping, the brain is highly active and busy as it decides what to keep, what to link, how to link new and already existing entries, and what to erase. So sleep is important. Just in passing, there are studies showing that naps are a good thing too. Yes. So allow yourself a break every now and then, and use some of them if possible for a short nap. Your brain will switch right into consolidation mode, replaying important entries and making room for new ideas and information. You can catch up on sleep on your flight back home. Then let's come to 5. We are beginning to see what devoted educators have always known. The use of movements makes it easier for learners to understand meaning. Thanks to body movements, language comes alive and thus becomes more palpable. Learning with gestures, mime, and body movements makes it easier to form links and connotations. Plus, movements enhance the formation of corresponding pictures in the mind. So, movement-based language teaching is teaching with the brain in mind. What is more, movements often lead to an enhancement of the learning experience, bringing together cognition and emotion. And this leads us to our next topic, the influence of emotions. In the picture, you can see the biochemical ingredients of love, any kind of love. Oxytocin, the hormone that is released in large amounts during childbirth, inducing labor, but it is also a constituent of love. C-wave, love hurts. Oxytocin plays a role in bonding and social behavior. Vasopressin is a so-called peptide hormone, which means that it consists chains of amino acids. and vasopressin is involved in caretaking behavior. Last but not least, there is dopamine as the third major ingredient of love. This neurotransmitter is associated with the brain's pleasure, motivation, and reward system. Dopamine also triggers pleasurable learning experiences. I like to stress that emotions have a strong influence on what we learn, with parts of the limbic system acting as a filter, how we learn, how stimuli are processed and stored in the brain, and whether we remember or forget. Thanks to neuroimaging, we have, like fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, we have the possibility to scan the brain and shed some light on what is going on in the black box. So you all know fMRI pictures. The fMRI images show us the activation in the brain while subjects perform tasks. And that's what negative and positive emotions look like in our brains. So it does not take an expert to tell that it is not the same. Speaking in terms of brain activation, we can clearly see two different activation patterns. And it is due to this difference in activation that we learn better, feeling at ease, relaxed, happy, than under pressure or when we are afraid. In conclusion, we can say that positive emotions clearly outperform negative ones. Negative emotions make it harder for our brain to learn, but still, unless there is debilitating fear in our system, our brain keeps on learning. I'm sure you are familiar with these findings and know about the desirable effects of positive emotions on learning. Note that the brain, as the organ that is responsible for learning, is always learning, even under pressure. So there is no black and white picture here. The important message is that we learn better and differently with positive emotions than with negative ones. And why is that so? How is it possible, after all, that negative emotions may have a detrimental effect on learning? Well, in a nutshell, I'd say it's because of, again, the limbic system. Strictly or precisely speaking, because of the amygdala. The amygdala receives input from all senses and runs an immediate harmfulness check on the incoming information. Activation of the amygdala causes intense emotions, especially fear of repulsion and so on. The amygdala plays an important role in emotional learning and memory. So it is a common misunderstanding to reduce the amygdala's function to negative emotions. In reality, the amygdala acts as our brain's alarm system. When we are under pressure, feel stressed or afraid, the amygdala is on, and it is communicating with other brain regions, thus blocking certain learning mechanisms. As a result, we are not able to be creative, for example. What is more, we know by now that knowledge and competences are stored together with traces of the emotional experiences that we individually link to them. It comes as no surprise that our brain prefers positively connotated entries to negatively charged ones. Whenever we remember something, we automatically reactivate the corresponding emotions too. No wonder our brain strategically avoids reactivations of entries that would put us through the pain of re-experiencing negative emotions like anger, grief, or fear. However, or hence one preventative measure of our brain in cases of negative learning experiences is to establish no or only the minimum number of links between the negatively charged information and already existing entries. It is easier for our brain to delete sparsely linked entries, allowing us to avoid and eventually to forget. As an interim conclusion, I'd like to confirm that positive emotions are desirable, the brain is receptive, willing to link and store the inputs. Positive emotions contribute to optimal conditions for learning and maximum receptiveness. In a positive state of mind, we experience learning as enjoyable and rewarding. Dopamine or endorphins are released in our brain. So nothing works like positive emotions. Upon this, let us now think about ways to make our teaching moving, both emotionally and physically. Drama. The use of drama techniques allows teachers to involve learners emotionally and cognitively at the same time. It fosters the development of different skills while having positive effects on mostly positive effects on students' motivation, their willingness to take risks, as well as on the team spirit. Actually, there's reason to believe that drama in education is indeed a brain-friendly way of teaching and learning. And this brings us back to the emotions as well as to the integration of body-mind in learning processes. If practitioners take these fundamental aspects as starting points and translate the corresponding findings from neuroscience into educational applications, they are most likely to come up with suggestions and ideas that fall into the domain of drama pedagogy. Why? Well, because it makes sense. What I'm really trying to say is that thanks to neuroscientific educational research and other disciplines, we're increasing our understanding of what works in the classroom and why. For example, successful educators have always known that student activation is a key to success. Earlier in my talk, I showed you data from our research on movement-based learning and teaching and learning that illustrates the importance of student activation. And as I see things, activation is one of the main features of drama methods. Here are some more key features of drama-based education, apart from activation of the learners. We have action orientation that emphasizes the experience-based learning, the learning by doing, as in contrast to or in addition to learning by instruction. We have the involvement of the whole personality in most drama activities. Then, imagination plays a major role in drama. Another important feature is role-taking. The role emotionally shields the learner, which makes it easier to take risks in the classroom, to be performative, and to make experiential use of the foreign language. Let me add that risk-taking is an important factor in language learning too. Then the term collaboration leads us to the concept of social learning, but also from a neuroscientific perspective to the necessity of social interaction for learning to occur, especially language learning. We know from experiments where a group of children, in order to learn a foreign language, watched a video of a friendly lady who told stories in the target language. A second group of children, however, same time and place, did not watch the videos, but the lady came to visit them and tell them in person, face to face, the very same stories. And what do you think happened? Well, the second group had the chance to experience social interaction with the storyteller, and they actually succeeded in learning first bits of the new language, whereas the progression in the watch the video group was next to zero. So in my opinion, this illustrates the relevance of social contact and personal interaction in language learning or learning in general. The use of drama techniques in the classroom stimulates interaction and collaboration, thus giving the students a feeling of belonging, which, as we know from theories of motivation, such as Stephen Ryan's, is another major factor of influence. There are, apart from the already mentioned DICE study, a number of already existing studies on different effects of drama in the classroom, to name just a few. And at the Freie University of Berlin, we do research on drama in the EFL classroom as well. And I have recently launched a research project on drama in foreign language teacher training. Before coming to my last point, drama and teacher education, I'd like to offer you a glimpse at the results of an empirical study on theater and audio plays in the foreign language classroom. Based on the findings on the effects of body movements, we wanted to find out whether the staging of a play and the production of an audiobook, both challenging and product-oriented procedures, have comparable effects on the acquisition of vocabulary, the comprehension of a text, as well as on the acceptance of the related activities and the students' joy of learning. So how did we proceed? We planned the empirical study that was carried out by one of my former students, Mrs. Totzauer, as a part of her master's thesis as follows. We opted for an experimental control design where both groups got a nice challenge, thus avoiding the bias of some other studies where researchers offer something special to the experimentals only, whereas the control group gets no intervention whatsoever. As we know from John Hattie and others, almost everything makes a difference in the classroom. All educational processes have an effect on the students, especially when something is new. And that's what we call the novelty effect. And we know that it can falsify data if you offer something special to one group while depriving the other group of the novelty, but still wanting to compare their results, so apples and oranges. So we offered the novelty to both groups based on Oscar Wilde's Canterville Ghost. The experimental group set out to stage the text as a play, whereas the control group sat still at a table in order to minimize background noise during recording. So we thought that by giving all students a challenge and by keeping most other factors of influence constant in both groups, we might be able to tell something about the staging effect in contrast to the recording effect. And here are the results of, these are the results of the experimental group. The graph shows the experimental group only in this case, and it's high performing to low performing from left to right. The first test round, black columns, the second test gray columns, and the third light gray. So we have this division stratifying sample where we put the equal amount of students, high-performing, mid and low-performing students in both groups. And these are the results. So what we can say is that all students in the experimental group, those who staged the play, increased their competences and knowledge. All students participated in 3 test rounds with an interim phase of, again, 6 weeks between test 2, dark gray columns in the graph, and test 3, light gray. This increase in knowledge over time is in line with the findings on movement-based learning. Note that a comparable phenomenon did not occur in the audiobook group, which means in the group that did not use body movements. Again, the study shows that in the long run, we are likely to have higher retention rates when working with embodiment and representations that involve the whole body and mind, or next to the whole body, whatever this means. Finally, I'd like to use these insights into one of our research projects as a bridge to my last one. And this is drama in teacher education. So in some of our classes for English didactics at the Freie Universität Berlin, we explore possibilities to use drama as a tool in modern language teaching and learning. Some courses for future English teachers contain elements of drama. Being a teacher means or requires performative competences. So we thought it would be a good idea to adapt our course requirements accordingly. All students in these classes have to give a presentation, and students may choose between an expert input on drama, for example, plus a handout, or a dramatization of a non-dramatic text plus a reflection paper. But students might wonder, what are these classes like? So fortunately, a group of students who participated in one of my drama-oriented seminars set out to answer these questions. And here are just a couple of their quotes. Shall I read it out? Yes. If you ever wanted to get an input into a creative way to teach English, you should definitely take this course. Being given the opportunity to actually use creative resources not only as activities in the classroom, but also as your exam, is such a welcome change to the usual theoretical essays. The class was a breath of fresh air in the middle of the week, and I would take it again immediately. It's nice to you. Okay, then I have a quote in German, and here I won't read it out, just summarize it quickly. The student states that the class reduces stage fright. You become more confident when you have to speak in front of other people. And with grammar methods, you learn interactively and by collaborating. It's creative and instructive at a time. And it's possible to bring these experiences to the classroom when you're actually teaching as a teacher. And here's one more, a very short one. Yeah. And this is what it looks like when students go bananas or simply perform in my drama-oriented classes at university. They choose a non-dramatic text, rewrite, adapt, and stage it. Then there's a feedback discussion after the dramatization, and they have their reflection paper. So that's the whole package. Just a couple of pictures for you too. Yeah, in the Smurple, we had stick puppets, voices from under the table, and a very charming narrator. And we had, for example, some dramatized songs. Here, two students told the story of a teenage love with the help of their favorite songs. Then we had the swim team, a short story on stage, with the swim team in the lecture room, bowls of water for the swim team, like some swimming, and even some diving as well. Then another classic, I'd say, is a bit from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Here we are on the demolition side. And then we have, for example, the Hunger Games with a female president in our adaptation, and a mixture of singing and performing. Nicely done. A classic, Alice's Adventures, costumes and props. And the cult classic, Good Omens, novel by Pratchett again. If you like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and have not yet read this book, you are gonna love it. This one was adapted to the scene with a nice combination of music, narration, and dialogue on the stage. And here's my last one, last but not least, The Telltale Heart. by Edgar Allan Poe. Okay, and that's it. That was my talk on drama activities in a foreign language classroom from a neuroscientific perspective. And if you want to read more about what can be drawn from neuroscientific knowledge, if you have basic reading competences in German, this is your book. So if you're interested in the book, I'll put a couple of handouts outside on the table. But upon this, and above all, I'd like to thank you for your attention. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed, Michaela Sambanis, for this very engaging, inspiring talk. We have a few minutes, I guess, for a discussion. We started a bit late, so we can take a few minutes now, and Morgan kicks it off.
I was really impressed by the study of connecting movement to learning language, and I wanted to ask if the movement had to be sort of specifically or realistically associated with the word, or if it could be a sort of an abstract association. Was there sort of a difference between the two, or?
Excellent question. So we had to do a lot of research to be able to come up with some kind of answer to this question. Actually, we started off with symbolic gestures, because it's the first thing that comes to mind. If you have to learn a word, you think of some symbolic gesture. So this worked well. Then we tried to work with several gestures for the same, leaving it open to the students, which one to use. Didn't work at all. Because somehow there's confusion, and the brain tries to sort out. Same goes for gestures that make no sense. When something is blocked in our brain, as we always try to find a logical explanation in everything, yeah? Our brain, or certain capacities of our brain seem to be blocked then. But we had abstract words, and what we actually do in scenic learning is to think of contexts where you might use this. One of my examples is she jumped the turnstile. Yeah. So you have the situation in your mind. There's a lady, and she has an appointment. She has no money on her, but she has to get the subway. So something we'd never do, of course. She's in a rush, and she jumped. Yeah, you do this jumping the turnstile, and you have a movement, something that shows you the whole situation and how it's embedded. But also we use gestures for abstract nouns, and then we discuss with the students, or we just agree upon a gesture. And often then it's gestures that somehow represent the sound of the words to the students. It seems to be most accessible.
Yes,
A follow-on question. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. You mentioned also a study into yoga-based learning.
Yes.
Benita vocabulary.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know, and it links to the former question, the gestures or the yoga positions.
Yes.
Were they linked to the meaning of the words?
They were linked to bits. This was based on a storytelling activity, and they were linked to bits of the story, which means, for example, there was somebody dying in the story, and there was venom involved, and so we have this position where in yoga you lie like a dead man on the ground, and then we put the whole sequence from the story on it. The person dies because of venom, and you have the position together with it. So
was it nearly like the telling of the story through yoga positions?
Somewhat, yeah. But it was far calmer than this, repetition and making an action story and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for these results. I'll be happy to tell my teacher trainees about that. I have one more question about your latest study. You said one of your students, Totzauer,
Yes.
she was the one who who was a teacher while, is that right?
In this case, that's right, yeah.
Okay, so my question is, what was her theater approach when she did the staging with the students?
She didn't have a specific approach as to put it into some box. Yeah? She went there and did this project style. She told the students that we want to put this text on stage, and then she negotiated with them how to put it on the stage, and they developed the play together with the impulses. But same with the audiobooks. So she did the same. Maybe there's one thing I'd like to mention about this study, because I've had only time to show you the effects in the experimental group. There was some interesting finding beneath the surface. When we looked closer at the data, we found that in the control group, the audio play group, the students, the low performance students, profited more than in the experimental group, which leads us to the question whether, for some students, maybe the putting on the stage of a play requires a lot of attention, so that actually the learning might not be furthered as with the calmer method of audio.
But sorry, there was a staging and a performance in
Yes.
front of a public audience
Yes,
in the end.
there was.
Did you ask about whether that had an effect on your learning?
Yes, they reported back. There was a questionnaire, and they reported back, of course, that it had an effect. And but there was also a presentation for the audiobook, so we kept this alive, so that every group could perform.
I think Caroline was next.
From what you told us about stories as a basis for the yoga activities and the other side, the tube situation that you mentioned, do you think one can deduce that maybe context is as important as movement, and the context of learning new words?
I think so.
And drama history will also provide that for language learning.
Yes, I'm convinced. And the only thing is that I have not yet had the right idea to research this, because you'd have to narrow it down. Yeah? And if you come up with an
Maybe we
idea.
can talk about that, because I'm very much interested in research.
Yeah. But of course the context is very important. Yeah.
We'll go back to this side. Who was first here? Stefan?
You said that help us examine every experience and stimulus in terms of whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, and we know that all learners are different. So I suppose that some learners experience one activity as something that are unpleasant. So it's wondering if you suggest choosing one activity for all students.
It's an excellent question, also linked to the one with the audio play. Here we had a hint at that. Maybe it's not the best option for every student, but still with an audio play you are performative on a certain level. But yeah, well, as a teacher I'd say give it a try. And you know, there's a strong effect of the teacher. We know it. And when you come to a room full of energy and you believe in what you're doing, then give it a try. And sometimes they get the hang of it, you know. But forcing people into drama activities, I would never agree to that. So we have, like, you know, emergency exits in our drama projects where those students can take on silent roles, or they can work differently. So this is heterogeneity. Yeah.
I know this might perhaps go a little bit outside of the scope of your studies, the ones that you mentioned, but could you talk a little bit about music in this context? Or another kind of forms, I know, but it just, you know, there's various types of dramatization, there's musical dramatization, or I mean, songs trigger memories as well, right? And so is there any...
So there's a lot of research on music and brain activation. I'm just about to, you know, revise, like, it feels like thousands of studies, and I'm going to write some kind of article by the end of the year. So I'm in the middle of this research right now. what we can say is that music has a strong emotional impact on us, but individual impacts, different kinds of music. So sometimes teachers are disappointed when they bring a certain song they like very much to the classroom. Students go like, we, of course, we link memories to it. There are also certain effects that seem to be attributed to music, to, for example, higher concentration for a certain span of time, if you like the music and if it's activating. But then again, there are different stimuli that do the same. We talked about it briefly this morning, that there was a study that compared the effects of Mozart. You know, Mozart seems to be the best, but I don't say so, but in the media, they made us believe so. Then they in the other group, they took a Stephen King story, and they listened, the participants listened to this story while the others listened to Mozart. And for those who liked it, either stimulus worked for about 20 minutes. They have a higher retention, better retention. They're like, they are very fresh after this. So there are lots of studies, and this is highly interesting. But what we can say is that the mechanisms, when we listen to music, the brain uses almost the same pathways for music as it uses for language. And this can be a blessing or a curse.
Irish music is very good. 2 more questions. That's... You have to... Oh,
okay. I'm interested when I just talk about the novelty effects.
Yes.
And I understand that the hippocampus reacted in a positive way when the situation itself is new.
Yeah.
So when you repeat it, when learning itself becomes a pattern, does it still have the same effect when you used to use body movement to learn?
Yeah. Well, in the first place, it has this novelty effect, so which is good for starters. And something happens in the brain. But then, if you repeat it over and over again, that's the thing I wanted to point out is still it makes a change in most of the classroom, as you've said this morning. There's long sedentary time in many school surroundings. So if you tell students to get up and now we do something different and we'll move, in most classrooms this suffices to, again, activate the hippocampus, which, by the way, is not off. When we are awake, it is on anyway. But to get more of this attention of the hippocampus. So the novelty effect, of course, wears off for everything. But in most of the cases, it only needs slight changes to trigger it again. Yeah? So, for example, move around in the classroom, go to a different spot, do the movement there, is enough. Yeah.
Do you relate your research also to the concept of emotional intelligence? Or
yes and no, yeah. How shall I put this in a nutshell? I would say we know about it, but we have to think outside the box. Yeah? But of course, there's something like emotional intelligence or different intelligences, Gardner and so on, you know, that we might refer to. But this is not a leading concept now for our research. Does that answer you?
The drama, you would agree that the drama pedagogy enhances the emotional.
Yes, it does. It does. We have had studies with a little device. It's called VarioPort, and students can have electrodes on their body. Doesn't hurt. Yeah, and they have the VarioPort, for example, in the pocket. And this little device measures movement and heart rate. So then, as a researcher, you can look at what the heart rate tells you about activation, emotional involvement, and so on.
So I'm afraid we will have to leave it at this stage. Just to saying that this is groundbreaking research, and it might have also implications for conference didactic. I'm becoming aware of the fact that consolidation is necessary. So in the future we might plan conferences and supply hammocks